All right. And I read chapter 5 previous to this class. Would that be correct?
That's correct. Jacob, did you get a chance to read it?
I forgot to read it.
Okay. Well, just don't read chapter 4 because we're not going to do chapter 4. Okay. All right. So let me get back to what I was saying. Now that I've disconnected and reconnected, and I got the recording going. We're going to make that transition this week of moving away from. I mean, you're still going to learn new vocabulary as far as accounting goes, and you're going to still learn new processes as far as it goes. But now we start to apply some of that stuff to what is more of a realistic outlook. And with all of you being business majors, I know that you guys all understand the concept of break-even point. You know, at what point do we break even so we're no longer paying our bills, so to speak, and now we're starting to make money? Now we still because the more we sell in order to make more money, costs are going to go up as well.
We can't understand you. You're breaking up.
Hold on, Professor. Can you say that again?
Okay, so you guys just if I start breaking up a bunch, you guys will have to tell me.
You're back to
So
clear.
Yeah, you're back. To
okay,
clear.
so we are going to start looking at break-even points, and break-even point, that's the point at which we start making money. Now, it's not the point where we stop paying bills, because even though we're making money, the more stuff we sell in order to make more money, the more that our costs go up. Okay, so that's the big nutshell of this week's lesson, is understanding how those costs relate and how we classify those costs, and then how we calculate break-even points. And then we'll take, once we calculate break-even points, then we'll put a couple of twists in it, and we'll say, well, what if the price goes up, or our costs go up, or the sell point goes down, or we're going to start to throw some what ifs in there. But the thing of it is, if you remember how to calculate the break-even point, the calculation is the same for every scenario that you're going to get in your homework this week. It's just a matter of adjusting the numbers that you're starting with. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So let me see if I can get these slides up here. Oops, wrong button. Share. And I don't think we have any videos in this week's assignment where we're going to be watching videos together. However, I think next week we've got 2 or 3 videos that we're watching. The same guy that we had in last week's video, or last week's class, because when we get to some of the subjects that we're going to be talking about, again, I find it better if you hear it from 2 different people. And since I'm not there and can't bring a guest speaker in, we just do a guest speaker by video. And he doesn't even know he's a guest speaker. But fortunately, he's put his videos out there in common YouTube, so I can use them, and we don't have a problem with it. All right. Can you guys see the domino?
Yep.
All right. So let's get started here. So this week, cost behavior and cost volume profit analysis. You will also hear that abbreviated CVP, cost volume profit. Okay. It's just a process by which what's the best way to describe this? A process by which we look at the cost.
You're breaking up again.
Yeah, hold on, Professor.
Okay. Am I back now?
Yes,
Yep. A process
Okay.
by which is where you started breaking up.
Okay. So it's the process by which we look at what our costs are, and we look at the volume of stuff that we're selling, and we have to figure out, as we sell more, our costs go up, So we have to calculate all of that. And then we also have to figure in, well, what kind of profit do we want to make? Because the amount that our costs go up, which is what we're going to learn here in just a second, is a variable cost. Okay, because we're going to have variable costs, we're going to have fixed costs, and we're going to have what we call mixed costs, where we start to calculate where we've got both fixed and variable cost in the same calculation. Okay, so we're just going to learn how to identify the differences in these different cost effects. Okay, so variable cost, fixed cost, and mixed cost. These are the three piles. Mixed cost is not really a separate pile, but it's a combination of the other two. Okay, so let's look at variable costs. Variable costs will change in direct proportion to the volume of our activity. Okay, as an example, whatever product we're selling, it really doesn't matter. But if we're selling 100 of them and they cost us $25 each, our cost, they cost us $25 each in materials. If I sell 100 of them, it's going to cost me $2,500. Pretty straightforward. Well, if I sell 200 of them, the cost per unit didn't go up. It's still $25 per unit, but my overall cost in materials has gone up. Okay? So that's why we say that that's variable. Our overall cost is going to vary based on the number of units that we sell. It's not breaking up again. You guys tracking, or did I break up again?
You're back. You broke up for about 5
You
seconds.
broke up a little bit, but I think I got what you were
Okay.
saying.
This is getting frustrating. I'm glad this is a short lesson today. So anyway, so the cost is going to go up. And the reason we call this is a variable cost is because our costs are going to go up in direct proportion to how many units we sell. The cost per unit doesn't change. A lot of people look at that and they say, well, that's a fixed cost. No, when we talk about fixed costs, we're talking about something different. We just say that the cost per unit doesn't change. If you start trying to say that's a fixed cost, you're going to get yourself confused. Okay? Now, when you start going into other accounting classes, if you happen to, a lot of other professors, a lot of other accountants, accounting systems refer to this as a fixed cost because it's fixed material costs. But for the purposes of the way that I'm teaching it and the way we're directing it, you don't want to call it a fixed cost. Just call it the cost per unit. Okay, the cost per unit does not change. It stays stable. I tend to use the word stable as opposed to fixed. That way that we don't get confused. But I mean, if you look now, let me show you what this looks like if we put it on a graph. Okay. So here we are on a graph, 0 units. This is the number of units that we sold. This is our cost. So 0 units costs us $0. Okay. So however much because this graph doesn't match up with this $25 per here. Okay. Oh, well, yeah, it does. Kind of, sort of. Depends on where it's on. My numbers are off a little bit. I apologize. So when we sell 100 units, we're talking about 2,500. If we sell 200 units, we're talking about 5,000. Okay. So this is what it looks like. Now, this is a nice straight line only because I took it up in nice even increments in units. If we'd have sold 100 units, but then we'd have sold 125 units, it would have gone up, and then it would have kind of gone sideways a little. Still going up, but sideways a little bit. And then if we'd have sold 200 units, it would have shot back up. And then let's say we only sold 170 units, it would have dropped back down. So it'll look like it does when you see the news talking about the stock market, where the lines are going up and down. This is a nice, neat, clean one because I took it up by even increment units. Okay? The bottom line is, remember that when your variable costs will go up in relation to the number of units that you sell. your fixed costs don't change in regards to the number of units that you sell. Okay, well, let's look at that. Okay, before we do that, let's talk about variable costs. What types of things are we going to normally see in our variable costs? Let's take a Subway restaurant. What kinds of things are going to go up depending on how many sandwiches we sell?
The cost, the more sandwiches you sell, the more ingredients you have to use.
Right.
So you're going to use more meat, more cheese.
There you go. That's what I'm talking about. Those are the kinds of things those are the kinds of things that go into our calculating our, so if we're selling a sub sandwich and those sub sandwiches let's say those sub sandwiches cost us $6 to make. Okay. If I sell more of them, my costs are going to go up because I'm going to need more bread and more meat and more cheese and more of everything. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then now let's think about what kind of costs are going to be fixed at that same restaurant.
Rent.
Say again?
Rent. Electricity.
The rent on the building, the lights, so that the employees can see what they're doing, the utilities, if you will. Okay.
Salaries or
the salary for the most part. Now, depending on, and that's one of those, sometimes it's an iffy one, because there comes a point where when you're making enough additional sandwiches, you have to add additional labor in order to keep up.
Sure.
Okay. So that's one of the labor and salaries kind of is in one of those iffy categories. Okay. But the lights, if you're going to have the lights on from the time the sun goes down until you close the doors at 10 o'clock and you finish cleaning up and you leave at 10:30, okay, whether you made one sandwich that night or 100 sandwiches that night,
you're breaking up again.
Yeah, hold on, Professor.
Okay. Am I back now?
Now you are.
Okay. So if we're talking about the lights, regardless of whether you sell, if the lights are on from 5 o'clock in the evening when the sun goes down until 10 o'clock when you close up and leave, it doesn't matter whether you sell one sandwich or whether you sell 100 sandwiches. The cost of the lights is going to be the same, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a fixed cost. And we look at those, well, okay, so fixed costs don't change over a wide-ranging volume, okay? And the book, if you had a chance to read the book, and David, I appreciate that you did, okay, one of the things they talk about in there is straight line depression and salaries, okay? Yes, I agree that salaries are a fixed cost only in so much as you're going to have a certain amount of payroll that you're going to do on a given night, okay? But as managers, we have to look at salary as something that can be flexible because we may have to pay additional labor if our volume goes high enough. Now, that's not a calculation that we get into in this class, so you don't have to worry about that, okay? But think more about it, like we're talking about with the sub shop. And if you're, a fixed cost, your rent, your utilities, things that are good that you're going to have to pay, even if you only sell one sandwich, or if you sell 100 sandwiches. Okay, that's how you think. And for the purposes of the way we're running this, that's how you think about fixed costs. Okay. Now, unlike this graph that goes up directly in proportion to the number of units that we sold, over here we're going to graph it. Now, if you look per unit, this line's dropping off. Well, why would that be? Well, if we have a fixed cost that doesn't change, and we break down that fixed cost over the number of units, well, if it costs $100, that's my fixed cost.
Hold on.
Again.
Yeah.
Okay. You
now
see my cursor moving now? Okay.
You're good.
So if we have a fixed line of $100 in cost, regardless of what we do, if we only sell one, then we're going to be right here on the graph. because one unit's going to cost me that $100. But if I manage to sell two, what happens? Well, now my cost per unit's going down. Now instead of $100 for one unit, now it's $50 for one unit. Okay? Or if I sell four of them, now I've dropped down to $25. If I sell five of them, I've dropped down to $20 per unit. You see how that works? So our fixed costs are going to go down in per unit costs, where our variable costs are going to go up, and it's not based, I mean, it's based on the number of units, but our cost per unit doesn't change. It's because we have more units, we have more costs. Okay? And then mixed, and I put this slide in there because this is one of the best examples I can think of. You guys are probably not old enough that you've ever had to pay an electrical bill yet. Okay? But the bottom line is this. My house that I'm sitting in right now has a meter that looks very much like that out there on the side of the house. And I pay a certain amount of money every month to have electrical service at my house. Now, that electrical servicing, that charge to have electrical service at my house includes a certain amount of electricity. If I use that certain amount of electricity or less, I'm going to have a fixed, stable cost of my electricity. However, with it getting cold tomorrow night and me turning my furnace on, I'm going to use a whole lot more electricity. So now my fixed cost that's here is also going to have a variable cost because it's going to be so much per unit, so much per kilowatt. Okay, back now?
I think so.
Not yet.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So if I go over my set amount that I have to pay every month, then they're going to charge me a certain amount per kilowatt hour. So if I use, for ease of numbers, let's say they charge me $10 per kilowatt hour. They better never, but for ease of numbers, let's just say $10 per kilowatt hour. Okay? And if I use 100 extra kilowatt hours, it's going to cost me $1,000. If I use 200 extra kilowatt hours, it's going to cost me $2,000 over and above what my fixed cost is. That's what we call a mixed costing, because you have a fixed cost, and then at some point you go above what that fixed cost is, and you start accruing variable costing as well. Okay? And that's going to look something like this on a graph. Okay? And again, let's use I've just drawn a blank on what to use here, but whatever it is, we're selling something, okay? Drawing a blank on what to sell, okay? We have fixed costs down here, okay? Our fixed costs are represented by this red line. So we have $2,000 worth of fixed costs, regardless of how many we sell, okay? But the more we have in sales, now down here this is dollars, this could have been units, but the more we have in sales, the more our variable line is going to go up. You guys tracking with me on how you combine the two? It'll make more sense when we get into the classroom exercise we're going to do here in a little bit. Okay? But the three big things that
You're breaking up.
okay. Am I back now?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Okay. So the three big things that you need to remember from this section or this learning objective is that we have three types of cost. We have variable cost, fixed cost, and then mixed cost. Okay? Our variable cost is considered variable cost because the more we sell, the higher our cost is going to go. It's going to vary depending on how much we sell. Our fixed cost is kind of just the opposite. Regardless of how much we sell, that cost doesn't change. It stays consistent. You know what, guys? I just realized I don't have my light on, and the sun is going down, so it's getting dark in here. Let me turn my light on. One of you guys should have said I was sitting in a cave. And the sun was coming in the window when I first got started, so I didn't. It was plenty bright in here then. Okay, so we have variable costs goes up. Our cost varies depending on how many we sell. We have fixed cost. Our cost doesn't vary one bit regardless of how much we sell. And then we have mixed costs where in reality, what we're doing is we're putting variable and fixed together in the same calculation. That's the gist of this learning objective for this chapter. Okay, so cost variable, cost volume profit analysis to compute break-even point. This is, now we're getting into the meat of this week's lesson. Okay, so we have to make a couple of assumptions. That cost can be classified as both fixed and variable. Well, that's what we've been talking about so far, so no big deal there, right? And that volume is the only thing that affects the cost. Fixed costs don't change. If it's fixed cost, it's just that, it's fixed. It's there, nothing you can do about it. Variable cost is going to change depending on how much you sell. Those are the two assumptions. And the reason why I say assumptions is in other accounting models, they can play around with that and do different things with it. For the accounting model that we're using, this is the assumptions we make going into it. Okay? So if you look on here, here's our break-even point. Okay? This line, I didn't make this chart, so I have no idea for sure what this line is supposed to represent. And you know what? We're not gonna worry about the chart down here, okay? What we're gonna worry about up here. So break-even point, sales level at which our operating income is zero. Understand that's important when you're doing your calculations. You need to remember that break-even point is operating income equals zero. Because when you start looking at how much profit you want, then you have to have your break-even point plus additional money in your operating income in order to cover the profit. Okay? So sales above the break-even point result in a profit. Sales below the break-even point results in a loss. Pretty straightforward and simple. Okay? There's two basic methods that we're going to work with to calculate the break-even point. One is the income statement approach, and the other is the contribution margin approach. Back to your math class when you were in 6th grade and your teacher taught you long division, maybe in 5th grade or 4th grade, whenever you learned long division, and then later, a year or two later, somebody showed you a shortcut method for doing it, right? That's what it is. Income statement approach is the long division method. Contribution margin approach is the shorter. They're both accurate.
Oh, okay. I think you're back.
Okay, so
yep.
the income statement approach is the long division method. The contribution margin approach is the shorter method. They're both accurate. It's just you get to take a couple of steps when you're doing the contribution margin. You get to take a couple of steps out, and it's just a matter of simplifying the math problem. Okay. So this is the income statement approach. The sales price per unit times the units sold. And again, we'll just an example. If I'm selling a brush for $7 a brush and I sell 1,000 of them, our sales price, our sales revenues is that. So that's this up here. Sales price times the units sold. So our total sales is going to be the 1,000 brushes times the $7 a brush. Make sense? Pretty straightforward. The variable cost is what it cost me to make that brush times the 1,000 brushes. So if the brush I'm making, if I'm selling it for $7, but the brush I'm making cost me $3 to make, it's going to be the $3 per brush times the 1,000 brushes that I sold. Okay, so just remember that it's the cost per unit times how many did I sell. Over here, it's what did I sell it for times how many did I sell. The fixed costs are just that. They're fixed. They're going to be calculated, whether you calculate it yourself or whether the book calculates and gives it to you. The fixed costs are going to be the fixed cost. Okay. So if we're calculating for break-even point, what is our operating income going to be?
You're breaking up. Hold on. Now you're dead frozen.
Okay. So did you guys track with me up to the fixed costs?
Yep.
Mhm.
Okay. So if you know your sales and you know your variable cost and you know your fixed cost, we're calculating break-even point. What's our operating income going to be? Come on, guys. We just talked about it on the last slide.
Oh, it needs to be set to 0. Or it needs to be
Set
0.
to 0. Because if we take our sales minus our variable cost minus our fixed cost, if we want that to be our break-even point, that has to equal 0, right? Sales minus cost equals 0, and that's our break-even point. Okay? So just remember that operating income is 0. It even says it on this slide, set to 0. Okay? So we're going to solve for the number of units sold. Okay? Contribution margin. Now this slide looks busier, but it's a whole lot simpler. Okay? If we take our sales per unit and subtract our variable cost per unit, that's going to give us our contribution margin. Well, if we take our fixed cost and divide it by our contribution margin per unit, it gives our break-even point. This slide looks busier, but trust me, when we start putting it into application, it makes more. Basically, what we're doing is we're cutting a step out here, okay? If you guys back up and look at this one, it's this minus this gives us this, okay? It's a whole lot easier if we can say this minus this divided by this is our, it just goes, it's a faster process. So contribution margin ratio. Let me clue you guys into something. Okay. Anytime you hear in this class that you hear the word ratio, you're thinking percentage, decimal point. Okay. Because that's how we can either say 64% or we could say 0.64. Okay. And I believe, and we'll have to look, but I believe that either this week or next week you're going to do a ratio. I think it's next week, where the book specifically tells you to carry out to 5 points past the decimal. Okay, so make sure you read your assignment and carry it out to 5 points. Okay, but once we know our contribution margin, we can then back up and do it a whole different way. If we've got our contribution margin divided by our sales, that gives us a ratio. Okay, so this one is going to give us numbers. How many sandwiches, if we're back to the sandwich shop, how many sandwiches do I have to sell to break even? Okay, well, if I know what my contribution margin per unit is, what's my margin per each sandwich, what I can do is I can say, well, if I take my contribution margin and divide that by my sales, it's going to give me a ratio. If I take my fixed cost divided by ratio, that's going to tell me in dollars what my break-even point is. Again, throwing a lot at you fairly quick. We're going to take a break here in a few minutes, and then we're going to come in and we're going to start working an example of this. Okay? So profit plans. If we know what our fixed cost is, plus our desired operating income, oh, wait a minute, Now we're no longer talking about break-even point, right? Because now we're talking about a desired operating income. And break-even point, instead our desired operating, our operating income was set to 0. Okay? So again, our fixed cost plus our desired income, this one is fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio. If we now take that same fixed cost and add our desired income, operating income to it, we're still dividing by the contribution margin ratio. And this class, I hate the fact that I'm having to teach this class remotely, because this is the one, if we were in the classroom, I'd be scribbling all over the blackboard. The whiteboard. They don't call them blackboards no more. The whiteboard. Okay? But that's going to give us our target sales in dollars. Basically, instead of a break-even point in dollars, if we know we have a certain amount of operating income we need, it gives us our target sales. Instead of 0 for break-even, it now says, well, in order to get this amount of desired operating income, we now have to sell, we now can get our target dollars in sales. And we're gonna get so this is our fixed costs, and this is our revenues. Okay, this, however, is not our break-even point, because remember, our revenues, as our revenues go up, so do our variable costs.
Yep.
Am I still with you?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the next chart, now we've got the same fixed cost. We've got our sales line, but because our sales line's going up, now we have our variable cost in there. So this becomes our break-even point. I should have had another line in here. Oh, well, total costs. Okay, so I should have named that variable cost. Sorry, my apologies. I labeled that incorrectly. Okay. So this is our variable cost over and above our fixed cost. The reason I called it total cost, because if you look, I started the variable cost at the point where our fixed costs are already on our horizontal line. So it's this plus this amount already gives us our total cost. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. This green line just simply represents our variable cost, but instead of starting it down here at 0, I started it up here where the fixed cost ended. So this is our break-even point.
Yep.
There's the point at which we're making a profit, and there's the point at which we're losing money. So all of that stuff we've said so far, this is a graphing look at it. And by the way, no, I'm not going to ask you to make a graph. But I do know there are a lot of folks out there that learn better by looking at a graph. So I figured I'd throw that in there. Okay. So using our CVP cost variable profit method, okay, I told you we're going to look at the what ifs, okay? So our sensitivity analysis. So if we know what our break-even point is and our sales price changes, okay? So let's take our Subway sandwich, okay? And we've determined that our break-even point on selling Subway sandwiches is 1,000 sandwiches if we're selling them for $6 a piece. We got to sell 1,000 sandwiches in order to break it in. Let's say we're going to sell 100 sandwiches at $6 a piece. That's our break-even point. Okay. Well, if we increase the sales price of that sandwich from $6 to $7, we're going to do our break-even point.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, you cut out.
Okay. So if our sales price of our Subway sandwich is $6 a sandwich, and we've determined that in order to break even, we have to sell 100 sandwiches. If we increase the cost of the sandwich to $7 a sandwich instead of $6, what's that going to do to our break-even point?
Lower it.
It's going to lower it because our costs aren't going to change, right? But if we're selling it for more, then we don't have to sell as many. Okay? Obviously, it's adverse. If we charge less for the sandwich, we got to sell more of them. Okay? So now let's look at our other variable in here. Because basically you got three variables. You got your sales price, you got your variable cost, and you got your fixed cost. So if we've got our $6 sandwich, and our break-even point is 1,000 sandwiches, or excuse me, 100 sandwiches. Okay, if our variable cost goes down, meaning now instead of paying 70 cents for my bun, I'm paying 60 cents for my sandwich bun. So if our variable cost goes down, what's that going to do to our break-even point?
It'll drop it.
It'll drop it because we're not paying as much per sandwich. Obviously, the inverse, it works again here. If our cost for bun goes from 70 cents to 80 cents, then we're going to have to sell more in order to break even. Okay? And it's pretty much the same thing with our fixed cost. If our fixed costs go up, we got to sell more. If our fixed cost goes down, we don't have to sell as many. Okay? Just keep that in mind because that's going to affect your homework and how we think. I shouldn't say your homework. Yes, it's going to affect your homework, but it affects how we think about or how we approach calculating break-even points. Okay. All in that though. Okay. When it goes up or when it goes down, it's just a matter of how does it affect it. Breaking up again?
Yeah, but you're back now.
Okay. So all of it's going to affect our break-even point. It's just a matter of understanding as one goes one direction, what does that do to our break-even point? Some things when it goes up, it's going to make it go up. Some things when it goes down, it's going to make it go down. Most things, if our cost goes up, our break-even point goes down. On the sales, if our sales goes up, our break-even point goes down. On our cost, if our costs go up, our break-even point goes up. Okay, so you just got to remember which side of the equation you're working on. Here's a little bit of chart so if our sales price increase, contribution margin is going to increase, and our break-even point is going to decrease. And the reason the contribution margin is going to increase is because remember, to get the contribution margin, it's sales minus variable cost gives us our contribution margin. So if our sales goes up, if our variable cost doesn't change, our contribution margin is going to increase. We're going to have more money left over from our sales in order to cover the fixed costs. Margin of safety. I'm going to come back to this once we do this, but let's go ahead and take a break before we get into this. I have 6:45 now. Let's come back at 7 o'clock. Again, like I said, tonight's going to be a short night, which is a good thing the way the internet connection is. But we'll get into this when we come back. Okay.
David is present.
Hey. Oh, my wife was evil this evening. I opened the door. My office is basically it's a bedroom that I just have set up as an office, but it's the farthest point away from the kitchen in my house. And I opened the door and walked out, and this smell from my kitchen just smacked me. She made beef tips and brown gravy served up over egg noodles. So I inhaled a small bowl of it during the break, and when we get done, I'm gonna go back and have a big old bowl. Oh man, I didn't smell it at all sitting in here while we were talking earlier. I told her she's evil. Okay.
Didn't smell it. We would have been taking a 30-minute break.
Yeah, if I could have smelled it, you just might have. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and hit this. Look, I guess I should put the slide back up there, shouldn't I? Okay, you guys seeing the slide?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so margin of safety. Basically, all that means is if we have expected sales and we know what our break-even point is, it's going to give us. So if our break-even point is 100 and we sell 125, our margin of safety is 25, right? Anything above our break-even point becomes our margin of safety. It's not necessarily, I mean, it is our profit, but we're not necessarily talking about profit at this point. But when we calculate our break-even point, anything that's above our break-even point becomes our margin of safety. So if we sold 125 of them, our break-even point is 100, our margin of safety is 25. Kind of the same thing on the dollars. If we know our break-even point is a certain dollar amount, if we expect to sell more than that, our margin of safety is the difference between how much we expect to sell and what our break-even point is. Pretty simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
The book makes it sound a whole buttload more complicated. It's really not.
Yeah.
Okay? So, if you have your book available, I would like for you to get your book out, and we're going to go to, what page is this? Page 246. Because it has this exercise in the book, and we're going to work through this exercise.
I left my book in the other room. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Same story here.
Was she not happy that I closed the door?
All right, I'm back with mine. What page?
On page 246. And this next set of slides is the problem 5-20 on
All right, I'm there.
246. Okay? So, country driving school charges $230 per student. Stop. Again, I told you guys before, one of the biggest problems that your generation has is that nobody touched how to read story problems right. Okay? So as we move forward for the rest of this class, when we go to the book and we start reading the story problems, I'm going to show you guys how to read story problems right. Because if you can't read the story problems, you can't do accounting. Because that's all accounting really is. It's story problems. Okay? So the country road driving school charges $2.30 per student. Okay, so we know what our variable cost is. We know what our sales cost is per student, right? Because that's how much the student has to pay. So we know what our sales cost is per student, right? get my mouse over here closer to me. It's the $230 a student. Okay. To administer the written test. The variable cost is $70 per student. Okay, including trainers' wages, materials, gasoline. All of the trainers' wages, material, gasoline, that's ancillary stuff. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that the variable cost is $70 per student. Okay. The nice thing about it is moving forward from here, where we were doing a whole lot of calculating on what is the cost of goods sold or stuff like that. The book does a lot of that for you at this point, because they assume that you've mastered that part and we're moving forward. So they're already calculating the variable cost for you. It's $70 per student. Okay. Well, remember our earlier slide. It's our sales per unit, our cost per unit, and it's our contribution margin. Wow, I jumped right to the contribution margin. I didn't. I messed up when I altered these slides. I didn't put one in there for us to. You know what? Hang on a second. Let's back up just a bit. Go to page 224 in the book. We're just gonna kind of go through this page together, okay? Make that page 223. Okay, so our income statement approach. They got a nice fancy chart here. This chart in the middle of the page, that's blue at the top and green at the bottom, the bigger chart, that's the chart that you need to keep. I have a big old black dot next to it in my book, so that when I turn to that page, it catches my attention. Okay, when you're doing your homework tonight, this is the chart that you want to refer to. Okay, because if you notice, if you think back to the slide we did earlier, it's sales price per unit times the number of units sold minus the variable cost per unit times the number of units sold. Does that sound familiar to that slide we did earlier? Minus our fixed cost gives us our operating income. So now that's in the blue, that's the formula. Now the green is we're going to start working it out. Okay? And the story that they've got here, sales revenues equals the sales revenue equals the unit per cost of $235 per event in this case. And if you go back here and read, I think this guy's doing, he's doing, man, I can't think. He's playing music. DJ gigs. There you go. Okay, so if you go back and read this stuff before, it kind of gives you the history of all this stuff and the assumptions and everything. But I'm just going right straight to the chart. So it says for DJ's events, okay, it's $235 per event in this case, multiplied by the number of events sold. So $235 per event times the number of units sold. Okay, it tells us that the variable cost for him per unit is $115 per unit. So it's the variable cost times the number of units sold. Now, obviously, what we're figuring for is the number of units sold, right? Because we got to know how many units to sell in order to break even. And then the fixed cost. Well, what does it tell us up here that our fixed cost? Greg's fixed cost is $12,000. Okay. So now we've got the information we need. We know our total revenues, 235. So drop down into the green, 235 times the unit sold, minus 115 times the units sold. You know what, guys? Hold on just a second. Let me go look at something real quick. I may have. Oh, hush, cat. If you guys hear the kitty cat, she's in here fussing at me. Because when I came in a while ago, I closed the door, and she doesn't like it when she can't get to daddy. No, I guess I don't have one in here. I thought I had one where I'd work through something similar to this. It's just in the book here. Okay, so it's 135 units times the units sold, 115 units times the units sold, minus the 1,200 that is the fixed cost, gives us 0. Well, since we know we're calculating for units sold, we can say that 235 minus the 115. Now, if we take the sales revenue minus the variable cost, what's that giving us?
Is revenue per the one or per sold? Like how much we're making per item.
Say again?
If we take revenue minus variable cost, that's going to get us how much money we're making per unit.
How much money we're making per unit? Well, it's a part of the calculation. The term that we used earlier, though, specifically was contribution margin.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Give me half a second, and I will get back to my slides. Because when I clicked out a while ago, I clicked the wrong button and actually turned the slide off. Or slide show off. So I got to open it back up, and then I'll get back to it. My brain's still thinking about that pot of stuff in there. I told her she's evil. Okay, so let me get back to here. All right, can you guys see the slide?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is back to where we were, the income statement approach, okay? So look at the blue line in that chart now, okay? Our sales price per unit times the number of units sold minus the variable cost minus the fixed cost gives us our operating income. Okay? So if we drop down into the green, we know what our sales price is because the story gave it to us. We know what our variable cost is because the story gave it to us. We know what our fixed cost is because the story gave it to us. And we know that since we're calculating for break-even point, our operating income has to be 0. Okay? So that blue portion of this chart is this slide. Okay? So if you just doing the math, if we drop the units sold out, we just say the 235 minus the 115 times the units sold. All right, well, if we do that math, we have the 235 minus the 115, we come to 120. But you notice at this point now we don't have the fixed cost. Well, if we know if we know that our contribution margin, and that's what if you look at that number $120 on this slide, that's our contribution margin. Okay, let me go to this slide. Contribution margin, no, that's the ratio one. I went one too far. Our sales per unit minus our our variable cost per unit equals our contribution margin. Okay, this is the long method. I'm just trying to point out to you in the long method where that contribution margin is. Okay, so if you take the 235 minus the 115 to get the 120, that is the sales minus the variable cost gives you your contribution margin. Okay, but remember back to math when you're in elementary school. If you've got $12,000 on the left side if you got to move it to the right side, what do you got to do? Well, if you're subtracting it from the left side, you got to add it to the right side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now instead of 0 on the right side, we've got 2,000. Okay. So we've got 120 times units sold times 12, times or equals 12,000. Okay. So that's where we are at this point. So now if we take our fixed cost and divide it by our contribution margin. Well, if you look at this green box right here, they're doing the same thing. They're taking the fixed cost, which is the $12,000, dividing it by the $120 that is our contribution margin, and it gives us 100 events. So in order for DJ to break even, he's got to do 100 events in order to break even in his costs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Following that through? Okay. And then if you look at it, because in our exercise, the first homework assignment you have tonight, the first exercise is you have to figure a break-even point, and then you have to prove that it works. Okay? The easiest way to prove that it works is to go back to our original formula and plug that number for units sold. So if we take the 235 times 100 minus the 115 times 100 minus 12, so we got 2350 minus 1150 minus 12 gives us 0. You guys tracking on how to do the math to prove it, right?
Yep.
So that's the long division method. Let's take the contribution method shorter. Sales revenue. Okay. Sales revenue minus. Oh, sorry about that. Sales revenue minus the variable cost gives us our contribution margin. Minus the fixed cost. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I'm confusing myself here. Okay. So the short method is the sales revenue minus the variable cost gives us our contribution margin. Okay. And if we know what our contribution margin is, we can divide the contribution margin or the fixed cost by the contribution margin and get our break-even point. If you flip the page and look at that blue chart on the next page, that walks that through. So if you wanted to look at it on a spreadsheet, go down to the bottom of this page. Okay, our sales revenue is 235. Now we've already calculated that it's 100. That it's 100 units for break even, right? So 235 times the 100 units. So his sales revenue is 23,500. Our variable cost is $115 per event, and he did 100 events, which is 11,500, leaving us a contribution margin of 12,000. Our fixed cost is 12,000, so our operating income is 0. Tracking? Okay. And then contribution margin ratio is on page 235. I'm not gonna beat you up about that one. There is one homework assignment, so you need to look at what's there on 235. And it's just the contribution margin divided by the sales gives you a percentage. And then if you walk that process through, just as it shows you here in the book, okay? So now let's go back to the slide that we were gonna work, because this goes right to the shortcut method. 99% of the time in whatever business you're doing, you're gonna use this shortcut method, okay? But I would be wrong if I wasn't at least showing you the full-blown method. All right, so now let's go back to this. Oh, here, let me make this full size. Can you guys see that better now?
Mhm.
Okay, so let's get back to this. So we have the 230, the 70, okay? So if we have our sales per unit, 230, minus our cost per unit, $230 for each student that's taking this driving class, it costs us $70 to pay the instructor and buy the materials and all. Doesn't really matter what all goes into that variable cost. We just know it's there, okay? So that's our contribution margin is 230 minus 70 is 160. Okay. So then what does it tell us? It tells us that our annual fixed cost is $112,000. Okay. So if we know our contribution margin is 160, our formula tells us our fixed cost divided by our contribution margin in units, or contribution margin per unit. So if our cost is 112,000, and we divide that by the 160 that we're getting per student, well, then how many students do we have to have? Somebody do that math for me real quick.
700.
700 students.
Are you a math?
Okay.
Do you have a calculator?
I have a calculator. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, he's got a calculator in his head, or do you have one down there by your computer? Or did you see it and you went ahead and did it, huh?
Well, I figured that's where we were going, so I did the math.
Okay. So, and then if you look down here at 5-20 in the book, it says, now we're going to do cost analysis, or we're going to do the sensitivity analysis stuff. Okay. So it talks about if you decrease the sales price from 230 to 200, then basically you just make the adjustments in your formula. So the reality is, once you get your formula set for your homework this week, you can use the same formula. You just have to duplicate it to show the additional variables as they change. Okay? So we're going to say if it was 200, this didn't change, but now our contribution margin changed, right? So go ahead and start on the math. Our fixed cost didn't change, but our contribution margin did, so we're divided by 130 instead of 160. How many students do we have to have in the class now?
861 and a half.
Okay, so 862 students in order to break even. Okay? So, and this is important for the homework assignment. Remember, it's going to give you, the very first problem you figure out is going to give you a set of numbers. Every time you go to the next requirement, make sure you go back to the original set of numbers. And it's going to tell you that, but make sure you go back to the original set of numbers. Because if you don't, the answers are going to be wrong. Okay? So in this case, instead of the variable cost, instead of the sales, so if you look, now the sales has gone back to 230, okay? So we put the sales back to where it belongs, but now we're going to decrease our variable cost, which is going to increase our margin. So now instead of dividing by 160, we're dividing by 180, and the number should be less than 700, right?
622.
So you guys see how changing one of these variables in here will affect, I think I even have one where the fixed cost changes. Yeah. And then the book gives us that. Okay. So now we still got $230 per student, still costs us $70 per student. Contribution margin is 160, but now we got $10,000 less in fixed costs. We got a better deal on the rent. I don't know. Okay. But we got a better, so what's that going to give us now?
638.
Okay. So because this all stayed the same, but our fixed cost went down, so the number of students that we have to have for a break-even point went down. Again, pretty straightforward, right? Okay, now I have elected not to for a couple of reasons. One, because of the way the internet connection's been working, but two, when you get into calculating multiple production lines, yeah, that's exactly what I say. Yes, I know how to do it. And do I think that it's critical for the exercise and the purposes that I'm trying to get you guys to understand? No, I do not. Okay. Understand in business, though, very seldom do we ever have just one line. So we have to be able to do multiple lines of products, knowing and figure out what our breaking point is. When you start talking about breaking point, you got multiple lines. A lot of times, what you have to do, that's where the contribution margin ratio comes in so much to play, because you got to figure a lot of different percentages. There's a certain percent of your break-even point is going to come in dollars anyway. It's going to come from this line. Some of it's going to come from this line. Some of it's going to come from line, A, B, and C, or A through F, however many product lines you have. Okay, so, but for the purposes of this class, I don't get up too deep off into that. If you guys were graduate students, yeah, then I'd beat you up pretty hard. Okay, so what I want to do at this point is I want to pull the homework assignment up just to make sure you guys are tracking with me as to what I'm asking for. I didn't used to do this, but like I said at the beginning of the class, I'm not necessarily here to just give you guys information. I'm here to make sure you understand. So I would much rather you understand going into it what I'm expecting on the homework. Oops. Let me do it this way. Hit the download button. Oh, I'm still sharing, so you guys are seeing this process, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. So, Storytime Park. And again, make sure that you pull your book out when you're doing your homework assignment, because I might have done some typos in here. I think this one I've got most all of the stuff, okay? But here, it tells you that, so requirement 1, you have to take the information that they give you for Storytime Park, and you have to build yourself a little chart here, and you're gonna track and so it says compute the number of tickets Storytime is going to have to sell to break even. Okay, so you're going to have to calculate how many tickets they got to sell to break even. Okay, then you're going to have to do it in dollars, which means you're going to have to do that contribution margin ratio. Okay, well, if you've got this part figured out, it's going to make this part a whole lot easier. Okay. So you're going to fit. So you're going to calculate the ratio, and then you're going to use that ratio to figure out the dollar amount. Oh, I thought this was. Did I? Oh, okay. So compute the number of tickets. Look at 5-5 requirement 1. Compute the number of tickets. Storytime must sell to break even. So you're going to have to do the break even calculation in here. Okay. Then conduct a numerical proof to show your answers correct. So remember that slide, that chart I showed you in the book, for how you prove it's correct. Okay.
It says numerical professor. Can I just type in the math professor's name?
Say that again.
Look at what's written under 5-5 requirement 1. Can I just type in the math professor's name?
No.
It says PROFF, not PROOF.
Yeah. It's a typo. That's the reason I said read the book. Okay. So once you get done with 5-5 and 5-6, then when you get down here, you're going to skip 5-7. You're going to get down to 5-8, and you're going to use the same numbers that you started off with up here, but they're going to tell you, okay, instead of $70, now it's $60. So you're going to have to do the same calculations that you did for 5-5. You're just going to do it for 5 with different set of numbers in there. Okay. And then, but then it says ignore the information for requirement 1, meaning instead of 60, you're going to put it back to 70, and you're going to do it, and so you're going to change a different variable. Every time you move one step to the next, to ignore it and go back to the original set of numbers. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got 5.5 and 5.6 to do. And then 5.8 and 5.9, 5.8 and 5.9 are basically that sensitivity stuff where we're looking at the, if the variables change, what happens? And then 5.10 down here is computing your safety margins. Okay? Remember we talked about the safety margins. And again, if you guys have any questions or when you're doing your homework, this is a good one to go back to the slides for. You guys remember how to get to the slides, right? Okay.
Mhm.
This is a very good lesson if you're going, you went, huh? I know we talked about that, but go back to the slides because the slides lay this stuff out for you very easily. Okay? Any questions?
Nope.
If not, you guys have a good week. Again, I know I cut it a little short this week. I just cut some of the slides and some of the discussion out. Stuff that the good stuff that you need to know, but we can cover it at another point, and be done with this crappy internet connection tonight. So you guys have a good night, and I will see you all next week.
All right.
See you
You've
next
still
week,
been
Professor.
breaking up. We just got tired of telling you.
You know what? I don't doubt that at all.
All right. See you next week.
Later.